The Mastiff shouldn't have made it to Dylan Vance's door. Not through that storm. Not with a torn chain still hanging from her neck and 2 newborns hidden beneath her chest. But she came anyway, carrying an old brass tag in her mouth, a tag with 3 hand-cut letters that didn't belong to her. Before the snow stopped falling, a man who'd never opened a door for anyone would learn she wasn't asking to come in. She was asking him to answer for something. February came down hard on Providence that morning, blowing off Narragansett Bay in white sheets until the windows of the old house on Vinton Street looked scrubbed with bone dust. Dylan Vance was 37. He ran the port, the freight, the paper, and the men who moved all 3, and he'd done it long enough that people crossed at 12th Avenue rather than pass him on the same sidewalk. Black hair combed back, gray eyes that priced a room before they ever warmed to it, a thin scar under his left jaw, the remnant of a blade from a rival Boston family's failed hit 5 years ago, turned pale when the cold got into it. Dylan Vance wasn't just a businessman. He was the undisputed Mafia boss of Federal Hill, the man who controlled every illicit container slipping through the Providence docks, and whose silent nod decided who breathed in this city. He wore a black wool overcoat cut by a tailor who never asked questions, and his father's cracked Patek, still keeping time as if the years hadn't ever tried to take it. He remembered the name of every man who owed him money. He couldn't remember which drawer his mother kept her house key in. He was there because it was the 14th of February, and 3 years ago that morning, Rosalind Vance had died alone in a hospital 11 minutes from where he'd been standing, with his phone buzzing 6 times in his coat pocket, while he handled something that couldn't wait. He still woke with his right hand closed around a phone that wasn't there. At 6 minutes past 9, 3 scratches came at the back door. Not hard, not even uncertain. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. He didn't move. The wind had been throwing branches at that house all night. Then came a sound that wasn't wood, and wasn't weather low, torn, and pitched somewhere underneath the storm. He opened the door. The cold hit like a fist. On the step lay a Neapolitan Mastiff, black as a closed fist. 130 pounds of her curled into an arc, not to keep herself warm, but to break the wind for something underneath. Ice locked her folds. Her legs shook. Her eyes didn't. Around her throat, the fur was rubbed to nothing in an old ring where something had been too tight for too long. She didn't bark. She didn't beg. She looked at Dylan Vance the way a soldier looks at the last officer left standing. And when she lifted her chest 1 inch off the boards, he heard it small, thin, and impossible in all that snow, crying. 2 of them. Dylan had heard men cry, beg, bargain, and break. He'd never once heard anything like that, and it stopped him cold in his own mother's doorway. The dog dropped the brass tag at his boot, then turned her head toward the slope running down to the street and waited. Whatever she'd crossed that storm to say, she wasn't finished saying it. If a story about loyalty, second chances, and the people the world decides not to listen to means something to you, do us a favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs a little hope this week. And if you aren't subscribed yet, come on in, we keep the light on around here. Now let's head back to that doorway on Vinton Street. Because the dog was still waiting, and Dylan Vance still had no idea what was carved into that tag. He bent down and slid both arms beneath the dog, and it was heavier than he'd expected. 130 pounds frozen into something rigid, something that refused to bend beneath human hands, but he lifted it anyway, along with the 2 tiny lascives still clinging to its chest, carried all 3 of them 3 steps across the threshold, then kicked the door shut behind him. He laid them down on the rug near the fireplace. He turned the thermostat as high as it would go, pulled the wool blanket from the back of the chair, and before he could even unfold it, the dog tried to stand, not toward the warmth, not toward the bowl of water he just pushed closer with the toe of his boot. It was trying to turn back toward the door. He placed one hand on its shoulder and pressed down, only as much as necessary. "No," he said. "You're running." It collapsed onto the rug, not because he was stronger, but because there was nothing left in it. 2 tiny heads stirred beneath the wet fur and cried out again, and the dog twisted its neck around to touch its nose to them, counting them, then lay still. Dylan turned back toward the brass tag lying on the floor. He picked it up between 2 frozen. It was so cold it hurt. The front bore machine engraved lettering, perfectly even and professional, the kind any clinic would order in bulk. Riverbend Veterinary. He turned it over. The back hadn't been done by a machine. 3 letters had been cut by hand, with an engraving punch, a small hammer, and the patience of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. The final stroke, the V, had been driven too deep, so deep that the brass had risen along both sides of the groove, the familiar flaw of a hand that always put all its strength into the last blow, afraid the mark wouldn't be clear enough. The kitchen seemed to close in around him. He had seen that same flaw on another tag 20 years earlier, when he was still a boy standing beside the dining table in this house, and his mother hadn't looked up from her work. She had said that a dog needed to know who it belonged to. Then she had blown the brass filings from the face of the tag and continued. That was all she had ever said to him about it, and he hadn't asked anything more, because back then he had thought it was nothing but the strange habit of a lonely woman. The tag in his hand hadn't belonged to Duke. Duke had been her mastiff, an old, gentle dog nearly the size of a cabinet, who had died a few years before his mother passed away, and Dylan had paid for the cremation over the phone while sitting at Logan Airport. That tag had gone with that dog. He knew it for certain because he had been the one who told them to leave it inside the box of ashes. And yet the hand was still the same hand, the same engraving punch, the same final strike driven too hard. 3 letters that didn't belong to the dog lying on his rug, and that had no reason to exist anywhere in the world after that fateful February when his mother drew her last breath. He closed his fist around it until the edge of the tag cut into his palm. Behind him, claws scraped against the wood. The dog had risen again. It stood at the door with its weight balanced on 3 legs, turning its head toward him, then away again, toward the slope that ran down to Vinton Street, and it repeated the motion twice, then 3 times, slowly and clearly, like someone asking the same question again for a man too slow to understand. It didn't whine. It didn't bark. It simply waited for him to understand. Dylan understood. He slipped the tag into his breast pocket, grabbed the flashlight from the top of the refrigerator, and opened the door. The storm leaped into the house. The dog stepped outside first, staggering but still certain, and Dylan Vance, a man who had spent 20 years making sure he never followed anyone, followed it out into the snow. He didn't have to go far. About 100 feet from the front steps, where the slope began to descend toward Vinton Street. Something was moving through the white curtain, and at first he thought it was another one, a second dog, because it was crawling on all 4s. Then the flashlight beam found it, and it wasn't a dog. It had hair. It had one bare hand clawing into the snow, dragging its body another inch forward. It managed 2 more movements toward the house, then fell face down and didn't rise again. He reached it in 14 strides and turned the human shape over, and it was so light that his arms jerked upward from the force he hadn't needed. A woman, young. Her eyes were closed, her lips dark purple, and snow had already begun to crust along her eyelashes. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat and found a pulse, slow and distant, like someone knocking at a door from the far end of a long hallway. He lifted her over his shoulder and headed back to the house, and the dog walked beside him the entire way, no longer running ahead, only keeping pace at his side, as though its duty had finally been taken up by someone else. He laid her on the kitchen floor near the fireplace, a little more than 3 feet from the dog, and began doing the things he had learned long ago in places very different from this one. Remove the outer layers, 2 sweatshirts, nothing more. No coat, no lining underneath, only 2 sweatshirts worn so thin he could almost see through them. No gloves, her knuckles swollen red and split across the joints. The kind of hands that didn't come from one winter, but from many. Canvas sneakers soaked through to the ankles. He cut the laces with his pocket knife because the knots had frozen solid. As he turned out her pockets looking for identification, he found 3 things. A can of milk replacer for newborn puppies, the kind sold at veterinary clinics, nearly empty, with a cracked lid held together by electrical tape. A plastic syringe without a needle, its tip worn smooth from being washed and reused too many times, and a length of iron chain about 8 inches long, the links thick, one end severed cleanly by something very powerful. He lifted the piece of chain and turned it beneath the light. The cut was fresh, the exposed metal still bright, not yet dulled by the air. He looked at the dog's neck, then back at the chain, then slipped it into his pocket beside the brass tag and said nothing. No wallet, no driver's license, no phone. A person had arrived at his door carrying nothing that proved she existed, except the things needed to feed a dog that wasn't hers. He wrapped the blanket around her, raised her feet, and crouched nearby to wait. 7 minutes later, she woke. She didn't ask where she was. She didn't look around the room, Didn't look at him, didn't look at the unfamiliar ceiling. She seized his wrist with both of those cracked hands and held on with far more strength than that body should had left. Then spoke in a hoarse, urgent voice, distorted because her lips still couldn't move properly. The dog. He didn't have time to answer. There are 3 of them, she said. The mother and 2 puppies, down there. Please. Please, he said nothing. He only tilted his head toward the fireplace. She turned her face in that direction, and Dylan saw the exact moment she understood. It didn't look like relief. It looked like the last cord inside her had finally snapped. Her face twisted, not beautifully, not quietly, and a sob tore out of her that sounded like something breaking. The cry of someone whose death sentence had just been overturned after she had already finished reading her final words. She tried to stand and couldn't, so she crawled. She dragged herself across the wooden floor on her elbows, the blanket slipping behind her, and those 5 feet were longer than the entire slope outside. When she reached the dog, she laid both hands over its enormous head and collapsed forward, forehead against forehead, weeping into the black fur that still hadn't fully thawed. She counted the 2 puppies with her fingers, touching each one in turn, and only then did she allow herself to breathe out. The dog didn't move. Then it lifted its head for it and licked her face, once, only once, before lowering its head back onto the rug and closing its eyes. Dylan Vance stood in his kitchen with the pocket knife still in his hand and watched the 2 creatures who had nearly died outside lie against each other, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though they had done it many times before. He had thought the dog had come here alone. He had been wrong. He waited until her crying quieted, then asked in an even voice. The voice he used when asking questions whose answers would decide what happened next. "What's your name?" She didn't lift her face from the black fur. "Naomi," she said. "Naomi Ward." She managed to sit up after about 10 minutes, leaning her back against the leg of a chair, and began looking around, and Dylan watched her do it. She looked at the old cast-iron stove. She looked at the yellowed wallpaper. She looked at the apple-shaped clock on the wall that no one had wound in 3 years. Then her eyes stopped on the framed photograph atop the cabinet, the frame he had wiped clean with his sleeve only 2 hours earlier. And he saw the entire realization move across her face, slowly, one step at a time. She looked at the photograph. She looked at him. She looked at the black wool coat draped over the back of the chair. She looked down at the kitchen floor of a house on Vinton Street, exactly 3 blocks from Atwell's Avenue. And Dylan knew precisely which name had just fallen into place inside her mind, because in Federal Hill there weren't many possibilities. People didn't need to read the newspapers to know the name Vance. They only needed to grow up here. She remained silent for a long time. Then she pulled the blanket from her shoulders and began trying to stand. "I'll leave," she said. "Just let me take them with me." Her knees gave way halfway up, and she had to catch herself on the edge of the table. Dylan didn't help her. He stayed where he was, one hip resting against the kitchen counter, both hands in his pockets. "You can't even make it to the door," he said. "I'll make it. You just fell twice in 4 seconds. Then I'll fall my way there." He didn't smile. He watched her try a 3rd time. And for the 3rd time she dropped back onto the floor, breathing like someone who had just run uphill. And he realized she would keep doing it until she passed out. And she knew she would pass out. And she still intended to do it. That was information. He filed it away and he said, "You don't understand," she said. "I can't stay here. You don't want me here. Trust me. Why?" She lifted her head and looked directly at him for the first time since waking, and there was nothing in that gaze at all. No fear, no flattery, no calculation. It was empty in a way Dylan had encountered exactly twice in his life, and both times it had belonged to people who had nothing left to lose, and both times it had cost him dearly. "Then call the police," she said. "I stole that dog." In 20 years, Dylan Vance had heard hundreds of people lie to him in rooms like this one. He knew every shape a lie could take. The half-second hesitation before a number. The way people added details where no details were needed. The way they looked to the left. He had built half his career on reading the distance between what people said and what they were praying he would believe. But this woman confessed before she had even been accused. No defense. No mitigating circumstances. No story. She tossed it onto the floor between them like an empty wallet and sat there waiting for him to pick it up. And that unsettled him in a way a lie never had. Because with lies he knew what to do. "You just confessed to me," he said. "Yes." You didn't ask whether I was going to call. You'll call, or you won't. Me asking won't change anything. People usually bargain. People usually still have something left to bargain with. She said it without bitterness, without drama, merely stating it like a weather forecast, and that was when Dylan understood his problem. He had no leverage. He had never stood in a room where he had no leverage. This woman had no home, no car parked outside, no wallet, no phone, no one he could call, nothing he could take away from her. Everything had already been taken. That was the only weapon she carried, and she had placed it on the table before he could even ask. "Who did you steal her from?" he said. She didn't answer at once. She turned her head toward the dog breathing on the rug, and Dylan saw her hand tighten around the edge of the blanket. "From a place the police won't touch," she said. Outside, the wind shifted and hurled a fistful of snow against the window pane. Dylan took the brass tag from his breast pocket and placed it on the stud table between them, the back facing up, the 3 letters turned toward her. "Riverbend," he said. Her face went white, and this time it wasn't from the cold. Dylan asked no more questions. He pulled out his phone, scrolled down to a name he hadn't called in 7 years, and pressed it. The phone rang 4 times. The voice on the other end was rough with sleep and irritated at being awakened. "Who's this, and Sal?" "Dylan Vance." Silence. Then the sound of blankets being thrown aside. "Your mother's house. How did you know?" "Because you only call me from that number when something is about to die." 30 minutes. "Don't touch her." 40 minutes later. A pickup truck older than the apple-shaped clock on the wall crawled up the slope of Vinton Street, rammed through the mound of snow in front of the gate, and Sal Ferraro climbed out, 68 years old, a hunting coat pulled over his pajamas, cursing without pause from the street all the way to the kitchen door. Cursing the snow, cursing the city, cursing the Providence Department of Public Works and every generation of its bloodline, then falling silent in the middle of a sentence when he saw what lay on the rug. He set down his bag, knelt beside her, and for the next 20 minutes he didn't say a word to anyone. He worked. He listened to her heart. He inserted a thermometer, watched the number appear, and showed no reaction. But Dylan saw his shoulders sink nearly an inch. He pinched the skin at the back of her neck and counted how long it took to settle back into place. He ran his hands along each leg. At the right front leg, his fingers stopped, moved back, then stopped again. He closed his eyes for about 2 seconds. Then he continued. He examined the 2 puppies last, spending less than a minute on each, and when he finally looked up, he spoke for the first time. "These 2 are all right." Naomi, sitting on the floor about 3 feet away, released a sharp breath. "It doesn't make any sense," Sal said. "They're warmer than their mother. They've been fed. They aren't dehydrated." He looked down at the dog lying before him. "Because their mother calculated every calorie she had. Every single one. She knew she had only enough to make it here. And she spent exactly that much, not one bit more." He began hanging a bag of fluids from the curtain hook. Severe hypothermia. 3rd-degree dehydration. A postpartum infection. "I need tests, but I don't need tests to know it. And that front leg has been ruined for a long. Not tonight. Not this year." He inserted the intravenous line. "How far did she walk?" Naomi answered. 4.5 miles. Sal turned his head toward her. He looked at the 2 sweatshirts, the canvas shoes with their laces cut away, the 2 cracked hands. He didn't ask who she was. He turned back to the dog. Then his hand reached her neck and stopped. He lifted the fur with 2 fingers, tilted her head to one side beneath the light, and held it there far longer than necessary. Dylan heard him exhale through his nose, long and slow. "Have you seen this?" Sal said. "Yes." "You think it's from a collar?" "I don't think anything. Good. Because it isn't from a collar." He let the fur fall and sat upright. "A collar leaves an even band of wear. This isn't even. This came from a hay chain. Too short. Worn for too long." He picked up a piece of gauze and wiped his hands, even though they weren't dirty. "The fur there won't grow back. It'll never grow back." Naomi turned her face toward the wall. No one spoke for a while. The cast-iron stove gave a soft click. Then Dylan took the brass tag from his breast pocket and placed it beside Saul's medical bag. "She was carrying this when she reached the door," he said. "In her mouth." For all 4.5 miles, Sal picked up the tag. He turned over the front. He turned over the back. He put on his glasses, which he hadn't bothered to wear during the entire examination, and held the tag closer to the lamp. Then he stopped moving. Dylan had watched people receive terrible news in many rooms. The old man didn't go pale, didn't begin breathing faster, didn't do anything at all. He simply stopped completely, like a machine whose power had been cut in the middle of its work, and Dylan counted 11 seconds passing in that kitchen without anyone moving. Then Sal placed the tag on the table very gently, as though setting down something that might break. He removed his glasses. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Dylan," he said, and his voice had changed. "This engraving," he paused. The V, the final strike, he stopped again longer this time. "Your mother made hundreds of these," Dylan didn't understand. For whom? Sal looked up at him, and there was something in his eyes dangerously close to pity, and Dylan Vance hated it at once. "For her rescue shelter," Sal said. "My mother didn't have a rescue shelter," Dylan said. Sal watched the bag of fluids dripping. He didn't answer. "Sal, I heard you. My mother had one dog. One. He died in 2019, and I paid for the cremation." "Yes, and," Sal said. "You did." He adjusted the clamp on the intravenous line, slowly, doing something that didn't need to be done. "Vinton Street Rescue," he said at last. "Registered in 2001. She ran it out of this house and the shed behind the garden. I was her veterinarian for 19 years, until my hands started shaking too badly, and then I recommended someone else." Dylan heard every word, and not one of them fit with any other. "How many dogs?" Sal shrugged. "I didn't count. She did. 400 and something, I think. 400. Dylan stood in the kitchen where he had eaten breakfast through the first 18 years of his life, and tried to remember the sound of a dog barking. A bowl. A single strand of fur on a chair. He couldn't remember any of it. He had come back to this house 4 times a year, sometimes 5, sat in that exact chair, and she had poured him coffee and asked whether he was eating enough, and outside that window, about 50 feet from where he sat, was a shed he had never once stepped inside in 20 years. "You knew," he said. "For 20 years you knew, yes, and you didn't tell me." Sal finally looked up. "She made me promise." "Promise what?" "Not to tell you. Not to mention it. Not to let you find out." He said it in the voice of a man who had rehearsed the words in his mind for years, and still didn't like the taste of them. "I argued with her once, in 2012. I told her the boy had money, that he could buy her a proper heater for that shed. She stood up from the table and didn't speak to me for 4 months. Dylan placed both hands on the tabletop. He didn't tighten them. He didn't make fists. He only set them down, fingers spread, like a man checking whether the table was real. "Why?" he said. Sal didn't answer. "Sal. Why?" The old man lowered his eyes to the dog, and Dylan saw his jaw move once. Then he shook his head very slightly, not in the way of someone who didn't know, but in the way of someone saying, "I'm not the one allowed to speak those words." The kitchen fell silent. There was only the sound of the fluids dripping and the wind outside. Then, from the floor beside the fireplace, Naomi spoke. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was stroking the dog's head in a steady rhythm, and her voice was so tired it was almost calm. "Because she was afraid of you," she said. Dylan turned his head. "What did you say?" "Not afraid in that way," she said. "I didn't know her. I'm only saying what I see." Her hand stopped. "At the place where I used to work, some people brought dogs in and then stood outside smoking because they couldn't bear to watch. Not because they didn't care. Because they cared too much, and they knew they would do something. People hide the things they love from the people they know will take action." She shrugged. "Had she told you, you would dealt with it. Maybe she didn't want it dealt with your way. You are a man of blood and iron, Dylan. If she had told you Julian Reeves was abusing her dogs, you wouldn't have filed a lawsuit. You would have ordered his execution and had his body dumped in the Narragansett Bay. She hid them because she wanted to save those animals, but most of all, she wanted to save your soul from carrying another body to your grave." In 20 years, no one in any room had ever said anything like that to Dylan Vance. People told him what they thought he wanted to hear, or what they believed might keep them alive. But this woman had just spoken a truth she had no possible way of knowing was true. Said it in the tone of someone reading the label on a bottle of medicine, and she didn't even turn to see how he reacted. Because she was occupied with the dog, he looked at her. Not at the problem sitting on his mother's kitchen floor. Not at the thief who had just confessed. He looked at her, at the 2 sweatshirts, the cracked hands. A person who had arrived at his door carrying nothing but supplies to feed a dog that wasn't hers. Sal packed up his bag, gave a few instructions about the next round of fluids, and said he would return in the morning. The door closed. The sound of the pickup faded into the distance. Dylan stood still for a very long time. Then he raised his head and looked at the ceiling, at the exact place where he knew there was a trapdoor and a folding ladder. He hadn't opened that attic in 3 years. He didn't open the attic that night. He made coffee, set a cup on the floor beside her, sat in the chair across from her, and said one word, Riverbend. Naomi held the cup in both hands and didn't drink. She watched the steam rise. Riverbend Veterinary, she said. On Interstate 95, near the Warwick exit. A private clinic with an operating room, a boarding ward, and even a community assistance program. They take in dogs from small rescue shelters that have closed. They take pictures. They post them online. Everyone loves them. She took a sip. The owner is Dr. Julian Reeves, 52 years old. His name is on a brass plaque in the lobby of the University Veterinary Hospital. He called me his daughter for 3 years. What did you do there, technician? I had a state certification. I held veins, administered anesthesia, kept records. She lowered the cup. I kept records.
That was a problem.
Outside, the wind changed strength. In the late autumn of the year after your mother passed, I entered a euthanasia case. A female dog. End-stage kidney disease, according to the file. I signed the box for the witnessing technician. I didn't witness it, but everyone signed that way. It was a bad habit, and I had that habit. She stopped. 3 weeks later, I saw her, alive. Inside a kennel, in the rear ward, the ward where 3 people had keys, and I wasn't one of those 3. The same defect in her leg. The same scar. I knew that dog. Dylan didn't move. I pulled the records from the previous 6 months, she said. 31 euthanasia cases for chronic illness. 31 bodies recorded as having been sent for communal cremation. 31 crematorium invoices that I checked against the provider, and the provider had only 14. She looked up. Dogs don't die at Riverbend. Dogs only disappear from the paperwork at Riverbend. You reported it just before that winter set in. I followed every proper step. I filed a complaint with the State Veterinary Board. I attached 11 pages of records I had photographed myself. I used my real name, my real address, my real phone number, because I thought that was the honorable way to do it. She gave a very brief laugh, and there was nothing inside it. 6 weeks. 6 weeks until what? 6 weeks later, they found 2 vials of ketamine in my locker. There was camera footage of me opening that locker because it was my locker, and I opened it 8 times a day. There was no footage of anyone putting them inside. Reeves called the police himself. He cried while he made the call. She turned the cup slowly against the floor. I wasn't prosecuted. There wasn't enough evidence. But the board didn't need criminal evidence. The board only needed an open investigation. They suspended my certification. My complaint was moved into the category of accusations made by a disgruntled employee under investigation for stealing drugs. It died there. I checked twice a month for a year. It's still sitting there. She gave 3 more details very quickly, like someone reading a grocery list. Her boyfriend packed his things and left during the 9th week, and he didn't shout. He only said he had never expected her to be the kind of person who would risk an entire career over a few dogs. She lost her apartment in Cranston in March, and she had slept in a 2004 Corolla for 14 months, in the parking lot of a supermarket open 24 hours a day, because the lot had lights and restrooms and no one chased her away. Then I went back to work for them, she said. Dylan looked up. What did you say? Not Riverbend. Another facility in the same network. They hired people by the shift, paid cash, and didn't ask about certifications. I needed the money, and I needed to get back inside. She looked at the dog. I didn't save her because I'm good. I saved her because I had nothing left to lose. Those are 2 different things. He was about to ask another question. He opened his mouth, and the question was already there. A question about the network, about the other facility, about the kennel in the rear ward. But Naomi looked up at him first, and something in her face had closed. You listened very carefully when I talked about the dog, she said. You didn't listen when I talked about myself. He didn't answer. Don't worry, she said, turning back toward the rug. Neither does the rest of this city. Sal returned at 9 o'clock the next morning, with 2 fresh bags of fluids and a handheld scanner that he tossed onto the table with the rest of his equipment, then promptly forgot about. The storm had eased. The light coming through the kitchen window was white and flat, leaving nowhere for anything to hide. The dog was a little better, well enough to raise her head when he walked in, and Sal merely grumbled at her not to get too confident. He wanted to give her another round of fluids. The vein in her rear leg had been exhausted the night before, so he told them to roll her onto her right side, and Dylan knelt to hold her shoulder while Naomi held her head, and Sal took out the clippers. The sound of the blades seemed very loud in the silent kitchen. He shaved a square patch on the inside of her left front leg, blew away the fur, and wiped the skin with alcohol. Then he stopped. He didn't say anything. He only lowered the desk lamp and stared at the newly exposed skin, while his thumb moved back and forth over one spot, twice, 3 times, slowing with every pass. Dylan followed his gaze. Against the gray skin, about the width of one finger joint from the vein, there was a thin white line, old and straight, the kind no one could have seen while the fur still covered it. Beneath it, the skin rose in a slight mound. Sal placed 2 fingers over the swelling and pressed gently. "This chip has migrated," he said. He paused. "There's scar tissue over it." No one spoke. Naomi was still holding the dog's head and didn't turn around. Dylan stared at that white line and felt something very old and very familiar rising in his chest. Something he had learned to close off and put away when he was 19 years old. And he closed it off, put it away, and said nothing. Sal didn't say anything else either. He found a vein, inserted the needle, secured it with tape, hung the bag of fluids from the curtain hook, and did all of it with hands that were perfectly steady. And only after he had finished did he reach for the scanner on the table. "I brought this along just in case," he said. "When a chip migrates, it's usually damaged. The reader can't pick it up." He switched the machine on. It gave a brief beep as it started. He passed it over the dog's shoulder. Nothing. He tried again, more slowly, moving in a zigzag pattern. Nothing. Naomi drew in a breath and held it. Sal changed direction, passing the scanner lower, closer to the armpit, an area where a chip had no business being. The machine beeped. No one breathed. Sal turned the screen around. He narrowed his eyes. He reached for his glasses, put them on, and read the 15-digit number glowing against the blue display. He read it 3 times. Then he handed the scanner to Dylan without a word, took out his phone, and called the registry, whose number he had known by heart for 20 years. He read the number aloud. He waited. The kitchen was so quiet that Dylan could hear the woman on the other end, her tiny distorted voice repeating the information. Saul didn't ask her to say it again. He didn't thank her. He simply stood there, with the phone pressed to his ear, completely still. And Dylan had seen the old man freeze that way only once before, the previous night, when he had picked up the brass tag. Sal ended the call. He removed his glasses. He didn't look at Dylan. He looked at the dog. "The chip was registered a year before your mother passed," he said. "Registered at owner." He paused for a very long time. Rosalind Vance. The apple-shaped clock on the wall wasn't running. It hadn't run in 3 years. Dylan could hear it not running. "Registered address," Sal said. 41 Vinton Street. Dylan turned his head toward the kitchen window, toward the snow-buried backyard, toward the shed he had never entered, then looked down at the floor where he was kneeling, the floor of 41 Vinton Street, and he understood that the dog breathing beneath his hand hadn't wandered here by accident. She was coming home. Naomi released the dog's head very slowly. "You didn't know," she said. "It wasn't a question." Dylan didn't answer her. He set the scanner on the floor, stood up, and there was only one number in his mind. One simple number he couldn't make stop repeating. 2022. His mother had brought this dog home 1 year before she died. He had come home 4 times that year. He had sat at that table. She had poured him coffee, and she hadn't said a single word. He went upstairs to the 2nd floor, stepped into the hallway, and pulled the rope hanging beneath the trapdoor. The folding ladder dropped with the screech of metal that hadn't been touched in 3 years, and a column of dust spilled through the opening, turning slowly in the light rising from the window at the foot of the stairs. He climbed up. The attic was cold and low, and it smelled of old paper, that sweet, dry scent of things that had remained undisturbed for far too long. Light entered through a single skylight, falling in one slanted band, and within it the dust drifted as though the air up there had never been disturbed by anyone. He had expected to find belongings. He found records. 9 plastic storage bins and stood in 3 stacks along the low wall, each labeled with tape and marker and neat handwriting, arranged by year. 2001, 2000, so on, all the way through 2023. He opened the first one. Inside there were thin folders, one for each dog. An instant photograph was attached to the upper corner. Date received. Condition upon arrival. Weekly weight. Telephone number and address of the adopter. Signature. He turned through 40 of them, then 80. He stopped at a folder from 2009 for a small female dog named Mabel, And in the final note, his mother had written that Mabel had slept through the entire night for the first time in 11 weeks, and she had under the words entire night twice. He closed the bin. He didn't count. He didn't need to. 9 bins. More than 400 folders, 22 years. In the final bin, resting on top, was a cloth photo album. He opened it, and on the very first page was his mother, younger than he was now, her hair tied back hastily, wearing the blue sweater he remembered, sitting on the back steps with her arms wrapped around the neck of a large yellow dog he had never seen in his life. She was laughing. Not the kind of smile people gave for photographs. She was laughing with all her teeth showing, her head thrown back, the kind of laughter Dylan could have sworn he had never once seen on her face, not once in 37 years. He stared at that photograph for a very long time. Then he turned the page, and there were 200 more, and in every one of them she was laughing the same way. At the bottom of the bin lay a black hardcover notebook, the kind sold in office supply stores, worn smooth at all 4 corners. He opened it from the back because he had learned long ago that the most important thing was always written on the last page containing words. That page was dated just 3 days before she died. The handwriting was neat, though slightly unsteady at the ends of the lines. Reeves, records don't match. 31 dogs in 6 months must tell someone. Not Dylan. Never Dylan. He read it a second time, then a third. The slanted strip of sunlight shifted about 8 inches to the right, and he had no idea how much time had passed. For 3 years he had built an answer and lived inside it. She had hidden it because she was ashamed. She had hidden it because his money was dirty, and she hadn't wanted it touching anything clean. He had accepted that answer because it hurt just enough to feel true, and because it gave him a place to stand, the place of a man judged and found wanting. That answer had just been erased by 8 words. She hadn't been afraid of his money. She had been afraid of him, not afraid of what he might do to her, afraid of what he would do for her. She had known exactly what her son would do if she spoke Julian Reeves's name across that kitchen table between 2 cups of coffee. She had known it better than he had. And she had sat alone with 31 dogs written in that notebook and chosen to carry the truth with her, because she would rather take it to the grave than watch her son become the thing she had spent 22 years in that attic proving he didn't have to become. That wasn't shame. It was protection. She had protected him from himself until her final breath, and she had paid for it by dying alone 11 minutes away from him. Dylan sat down on the attic floor. Dust clung to the knees of his expensive trousers. He didn't cry. He didn't strike anything. He didn't make a sound. He only sat there with the notebook open across his lap, and for a very long time, he simply didn't breathe. He opened the notebook again and worked backward toward the front, searching for the name, and found it in April of 2022. One line, written like every other line. Female mastiff, approximately 1 year old, recovered from the parking lot behind the church on Chalkstone Avenue. Right front leg damaged before intake. Name, Bruna. Beside it, in parentheses, his mother had written 3 words. She isn't afraid of me. He closed the notebook and sat still, and then he remembered that she had died in February, and that the bins ended in 2023. And if she had cared for 400 dogs, then someone must have done something with the ones that remained. He searched through the final bin. At the bottom, tucked inside a plastic folder she hadn't labeled because she hadn't been the one to place it there, were 7 sheets of paper. He carried them downstairs to the kitchen and spread them across the table. State of Rhode Island animal transfer forms, dated exactly 5 weeks after the funeral. They stated that the rescue facility at 41 Vinton Street had ceased operations because of the owner's death, and that all remaining animals had been transferred to a licensed veterinary facility for continued care and adoption placement. The receiving facility's name was typed in capital letters, Riverbend Veterinary. The second page was a list. 19 Zims. He read through every one of them. Bruna was on the 4th line. He turned to the final page, to the space reserved for the representative of the transferring party, and there was a signature. It slanted sharply, written quickly, in blue ink, and the last stroke had smeared as though the paper had been pulled away before the ink could dry, or as though the hand signing it had never intended for anyone to read it. Dylan stared at it for a long time. He didn't recognize it. He knew only one thing, and he knew it absolutely. It wasn't his signature. No one had given him this document. No one had called him about 19 dogs. During the 5 weeks after his mother died, he had sat through 3 meetings, flown to Baltimore twice, and signed approximately 60 documents, and none of them had been this one. He placed the paper down and pushed it toward the center of the table. "Look at this," he said. Naomi rose from her place beside the fireplace and came over. She bent over the second page. She read the first line. Then she straightened so quickly and stepped half a pace backward, and Dylan saw her entire body go rigid from the shoulders down. "What?" he said. She didn't answer. She bent over again and began reading from the beginning, more slowly this time, and one hand rose to her mouth, and Eve watched her finger move down the list, stopping at every line. "Naomi, I know them," she said. Her voice was very small. "What did you say? I know them." "All of them." She looked up, and all the color had drained from her face. "I started at Riverbend just 2 months after that transfer date. This group of 19 was the first intake I ever processed. They all arrived on the same morning. I remember because I had never seen anyone transfer 19 dogs at once." She pointed at the paper with an unsteady finger. "Perry, Mabel. This one was named Otis. He was deaf in one ear. This one." Her finger stopped on the 4th line and remained there. "They kept this one in the last kennel in row B for 4 months. I fed her. I knew her before I even knew there was a rear ward. I called her by the name in the records because I thought it was her real name." Dylan looked at her. "You knew her for nearly 2 years. Yes, you told me you stole her. I did steal her." She pulled her hand away from the paper. "Then, 6 months later, they moved her out of row B. I asked where she had gone. They told me she had been adopted. I believed them. I wanted to believe them. I had 34 other dogs to feed that day, and I believed that answer because believing it was easier." She looked toward the rug beside the fireplace, toward the creature breathing there. "I left her behind once already," she said. "You asked why I crawled 4.5 miles through the snow. That's it. That's why. People imagined Dylan Vance worked by walking into a room and standing there. That had been true 20 years ago, when he still had to do it that way. Now he worked through telephones and money, and the cheapest way to learn everything about a man was to buy what that man owed. He made 3 calls that afternoon. The first went to a man in Cranston who specialized in buying stress-ups debts from small businesses and reselling it in bundles for 4 cents on the dollar. The second went to an accountant in Warwick who had once kept the books for 2 clinics and had been abandoned when they changed ownership. The third went to a woman at Providence City Hall whose son's college education Dylan had paid for, and he didn't need to remind her of it, and she didn't need him to. Within 48 hours, he bought 3 of Riverbend Veterinary's equipment debts for a total of $9,000 and became a secured creditor of the clinic itself. A creditor had the right to demand financial statements. A creditor had the right to ask questions. No one had to be threatened, no one had to be touched, and no one could refuse. The documents arrived on the morning of the 17th. He spread them across the kitchen table and read through them all morning, and what he saw wasn't a veterinary clinic. Riverbend was a funnel. Less than half of the incoming money came from medical treatment. The rest came from 9 other facilities spread across 3 states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, all paying Riverbend veterinary service fees whose amounts made no sense for places of their size. What Riverbend sold wasn't medical care. What Riverbend sold was paperwork. A dog entered through the back door with no history and no owner. Reeves signed a form declaring it an abandoned animal received by a licensed facility. From that moment on, the dog had an origin. It was clean. It could travel anywhere in the United States carrying a document signed by a man whose name appeared on a brass plaque in the lobby of the University Veterinary Hospital. The 31 dogs his mother had counted in 6 months weren't dogs being killed. They were dogs being laundered. He called Sal over to read with him because there were lines Dylan couldn't interpret. Sal read for 15 minutes, then removed his glasses. "This belongs in a federal case," he said, "not with the state board, not with the Providence police. Federal. Why? Because it crosses state lines. Because money is moving through banks. Because people are signing government documents and lying on them." He pushed the stack of papers away. "Some of those dogs never leave the paperwork, Dylan. They disappeared from real life a long time ago, but on paper, they're still being very well cared for by someone in Attleboro." Naomi sat at the end of the table and said nothing for 2 hours. Then she pulled toward herself the spreadsheet the Warwick accountant had sent. The appendix both Dylan and Sal had skimmed because it appeared to be nothing but a list of codes. She studied it for 20 minutes. Then she set down her pen. "Bruna isn't in any file," she said. "What did you say? The other 19 all have records. Transferred, adopted, or dead. There's paperwork for every one of them. But not her. She came in during March of 2023, and after that, she disappeared from every document for 3 years. She turned the spreadsheet around, but she didn't disappear from this. These are supply invoices, milk replacer, umbilical clamps, newborn scales, ordered on a cycle by the same facility, under the same customer code." She pushed the sheet toward him. "She wasn't merchandise to be sold. She was what produced the merchandise." Dylan looked down at the column of dates. He didn't need Naomi to explain. 6 times, 6 clusters of orders over 34 months, and beside each cluster the date the order stopped. He subtracted 19 days, 16 days, 17, 19, 15, never more than 19 days. He placed the paper on the table and kept his hand resting over it. 6 litters. Not one of them had been left with her for more than 19 days. No one spoke. The cast iron stove gave a soft click. Naomi turned toward the fireplace, where 2 tiny lives were sleeping pressed against the black fur. The first 2 she had ever been allowed to keep beyond 19 days. "You keep thinking she remembered the way back here," she said softly. "She didn't come to your house because she remembered the house. Mastiffs remember a person's scent for 7 years. She came because this was the only place in her life where anyone had ever been kind to her, and when she had nothing left, she went toward the one thing she knew had been real. She slept on the sofa in the living room, exactly 3 steps from the nest, and she woke 4 times every night without needing an alarm." Dylan knew because he didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table beneath the desk lamp with the papers spread before him, and each time she rose, he heard the sofa springs, then 3 footsteps, then silence for about 4 minutes, then 3 footsteps returning. On the morning of the 18th, the cast iron stove went out. He called a repairman and was told Thursday was the earliest anyone could come. He ended the call and turned around to find Naomi had already removed the front panel and was lying on her back beneath the stove with a flashlight between her teeth. "Thermocouple," she said, taking the flashlight from her mouth. "Soot buildup. Do you have sandpaper?" He didn't. She used the back of his pocket knife blade and a piece of aluminum foil. 40 minutes later, the blue flame returned. During those 3 days, he also watched her repair the leaking kitchen faucet with a rubber band, realign a cabinet door hinge, and restart Sal's pickup when the battery froze, using some method that involved a length of electrical wire and a great deal of swearing. "Where did you learn to do all this?" he asked. She was wiping her hands. "When you live in a car, you learn how not to need anyone," she said. "You can't call a repairman. You don't have an address for him to come to." Marco arrived on the afternoon of the 18th without warning, carrying a box of cannoli from the bakery on Atwell's and snow on the shoulders of his coat. Marco Vance was 41, half a head taller than Dylan, and smiling before he even came through the door. He embraced his younger brother. He greeted Naomi by name, though no one had introduced them, and asked whether she could eat pistachios before opening the box. He stroked the dog's head as narrowly as though he had done it before, and she didn't growl. Then he sat down, rested one leg on the chair beside him, and looked around the kitchen. "You brought a homeless woman and a stray dog into Mom's house on the anniversary of her death," he said. He said it lightly, almost affectionately. "I'm not judging. I'm only trying to understand. Are you having some kind of crisis, or is this a new hobby?" "The dog belonged to Mom," Dylan said. Marco stopped for half a second. That half second was very brief, and Dylan would remember it for the rest of his life. "Mom had a dog?" Marco said. "Since when?" "Since 2022, I didn't know. He broke a cannolo in half. Did she tell you?" "No, there you go," Marco said, laughing. "She treated both of us equally." He finished the pastry, wiped his hands with a paper napkin, and what happened next happened quickly, cleanly, the way everything Marco did happened. He took out his wallet, counted a stack of bills, and placed it on the table in front of Naomi. 5,000, he told her, still smiling. "Kennedy Plaza is 10 minutes from here. There are buses to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. You choose." He pushed the money another 4 inches toward her. "I'm not throwing you out. This is a gift. You saved the dog and you deserve the money. I'll take care of the dog. I know a place in Johnston that treats them very well." Naomi didn't look at the money. She looked at Dylan. "No," Dylan said. The entire kitchen went silent. Marco turned his head toward his younger brother very slowly. For 20 years, Dylan Vance had listened to Marco's advice about what to buy, what to sell, whom to trust, and whom to abandon, and he had followed it every time, and both men in that kitchen knew the exact number. Not once had he refused. Marco said nothing. His smile didn't change by even a fraction of an inch. He nodded once, gathered the money, slipped it back into his wallet, stood, kissed Dylan on the forehead the way he had done since Dylan was 10 years old, and told him to eat the cannoli while they were still warm. Then he left. That night, after Naomi rose for the second time, Dylan spoke from the kitchen table. "Why didn't you take his money?" She sat on the floor with her back against the sofa, about 3 feet from him. The stove made a soft sound. "Because that was the 15th time," she said. "You counted?" "Yes. The state board. Reeves's lawyer. My father. My former boyfriend left $400 on the kitchen table. Everyone pays me to disappear, and I keep taking it, and I keep disappearing, and 14 months later I'm sleeping in an car without heat." She watched the flame. "So the 5th time, I thought maybe I'd stay where I was and see what happened." They sat that way for a long time, 3 steps apart, neither moving closer. Then Dylan said, "Naomi," only her name, nothing more, and he said it without having to think, without checking it in his mind first. She turned her head and looked at him. She didn't say anything. But she noticed, what he still hadn't found was the capital. Riverbend had purchased nearly $1 million worth of equipment a few years back, and there was no corresponding bank loan, which meant someone had put money into it and didn't want anyone to know. He called the accountant in Warwick again and asked a single question. Who were the equity members? It took the man 3 days. On the morning of the 19th, a PDF arrived in Dylan's inbox, and he opened it at the kitchen table at 4 o'clock in the morning while the entire house slept. Riverbend Veterinary Group was owned by a limited liability company registered in Rhode Island called 16 Mill Partners. 16 Mill Partners had 2 members. One was Julian Reeves. The other was a company registered in Delaware called Bayfront Equity Group. Bayfront Equity Group had a single member, another Delaware company called Stonecourt Capital. 3 layers. Someone had paid lawyers to build 3 layers. And 3 layers were what a person built when they weren't trying to hide from the government, but from someone they knew. Dylan scrolled to the final page, the controlling equity member of Stonecourt Capital, as listed in the original filing documents, Harborline Holdings Limited Liability Company. He sat perfectly still. He knew that name. He knew it the way he knew the name of the street where he had grown up. Harborline Holdings was the company that held 3 warehouses in the Port District and 2 vacant lots on Allens Avenue. And Dylan had signed documents for it at least 9 times over the past 6 years, signing in the upper right corner, on the line reserved for the minority equity member, signing without reading because Harborline belonged to Marco, and Marco handled the real estate while Dylan handled everything else, and that was how it had worked since their father died. He read the page again, then he reread the entire file from the beginning, slowly, line by line, searching for the mistake. There was no mistake. He sat there a while longer. Then he reached across the table, pulled toward him the plastic folder his mother hadn't labeled, and removed the animal transfer documents dated March 21st, 2023. He turned to the final page. The slanted signature, blue ink, smeared at the final stroke. He had looked at it 4 days earlier and hadn't recognized it, and now he understood why. He had never seen Marco sign his full name. For 20 years, Marco had used only his initials, 2 overlapping M's, on checks, contracts, and birthday cards. The only things resonant with his full name were documents that had the word government printed at the top. Dylan stood, went upstairs to his father's old study, opened the second drawer, and took out the transfer file for warehouse number 4, signed in June of 2024, on a state form. He carried it downstairs. He placed the 2 documents side by side beneath the desk lamp. The same slant, the same extra loop in the 3rd letter, the same final stroke rising too high before fading away unfinished. Marco Vanza. Outside, dawn had yet come. Dylan Vance sat down in the chair and stopped moving. He didn't call anyone. He didn't stand. He didn't pick up the phone. He simply sat there with the 2 documents before him and let the calculation run through his mind, because he was good at calculations. That was what he had done his entire life. His mother died on February 14th. Marco signed this document on March 21st. 35 days, 5 weeks, During those 5 weeks, Marco had attended the funeral, had stood beside him in the rain at Swan Point Cemetery, had handled the arrangements because Dylan couldn't, had told him that she had gone peacefully, even though neither of them had been there to know whether it was true. And somewhere among those days, he had found the shed behind the garden, counted 19 dogs, and signed a document transferring them to a clinic he himself had financed. He hadn't hidden it from Dylan because he was afraid. He had hidden it because it was small. Because 19 dogs were a line in a spreadsheet, and spreadsheets were his responsibility, and he hadn't seen anything worth mentioning. The dog breathing on the rug about 13 feet away had been sold by Dylan's brother 3 weeks after their mother was buried. Outside, snow began to fall again. Dylan didn't move. He sat in that kitchen until daylight filled the room, and throughout all that time he didn't make a sound. Warehouse number 4 stood at the end of Allen's Avenue, opening toward the bay, and Marco was always there on Friday mornings because that was inventory day. Dylan arrived at 10 o'clock. He brought no one with him. He carried a folder. Marco was standing beside the scale with a cup of coffee, and he looked up and smiled. And the smile was real. Dylan knew it was real. That was the problem. "You're here early," Marco said. Dylan placed the folder on the scale and opened it. 7 transfer documents. The final page turned upward. Beside it, the transfer file for warehouse number 4. Also open to the signature page. He said nothing. Marco looked down. He studied the 2 signatures for about 3 seconds. Then he set down his coffee, and Dylan waited for one thing. Only one thing. Half a second of hesitation. A blink, a question meant to buy time. Nothing came. "Yes," Marco said. "I signed it outside." A forklift was moving. "You're not asking where I got this. You're Dylan. You get everything." He tapped one finger against the paper. "What do you want me to say? Tell me why 300,000, Marco said. In 2021, Reeves needed capital for equipment, an 18% margin, return within 4 years. It was a good investment, and it's still a good investment. He shrugged. "You asked why. That's why. There's nothing more to it, little brother. And the 19 dogs, what about them? You handed them over to your own company. I handed them over to a licensed facility because it was the only licensed place I knew, because I owned part of it." Marco said it very calmly. "She died. There were 19 dogs in the shed behind the garden, and no one fed them for 3 weeks because no one knew they were there. I found them, I handled it. I called 3 places. 2 refused them. The 3rd accepted them. What else did you want me to do? You could have called me. You were in Baltimore," Marco said. "And what would you have said? You didn't even know she had a rescue shelter." He paused. "Neither did I. That's the point you keep trying to step over. I didn't hide anything from you. I didn't know what that shed was. I opened the door, saw 18 dogs, and handled them the way I would handle warehouse stock. Don't turn your ignorance into morality, Dylan. Neither of us knew. The difference is that I was the one who had to clean it up." Dylan said nothing. He looked at his brother and tried to find the lie in him, and he couldn't, and that was the worst part. Marco hadn't killed anyone. Marco had simply failed to look. He had stood before 19 dogs belonging to the woman who had raised him, and seen nothing but a line that needed to be removed from an inventory sheet. "They weren't warehouse stock," Dylan said. "They were Mom's," and that was when Marco's face changed, not with anger, with something more exhausted than anger. "She raised me too," Marco said quietly. "You remember that, don't you? Dad married her when I was 6. My real mother was gone. She made me sandwiches every morning for 12 years, and she didn't have to do that." He picked up the coffee, then set it down again. "I stood in the rain at Swan Point and cried, Dylan. Do you remember? You didn't cry. You stood there like a post. So don't stand here and talk to me about the word Mom." Outside, the forklift went silent. "Are you angry because of the dog?" Marco said. "Or because you didn't answer the phone that night?" In 20 years, 4 people had said something to Dylan Vance they weren't allowed to say. 3 of them had left the city within a week, and no one ever saw them again. The 4th stood 3 if away, holding a cup of coffee, and telling the truth. That was what Marco had always been best at. He didn't threaten. He was simply exact. Dylan felt it rising inside him. That old thing, the thing his entire life had been built upon, and he realized how easy it would be to hit Marco now, and that tomorrow morning he would wake, and nothing would have changed, and 19 dogs would still be going through the back door, and Julian Reeves's name would still be on the brass plaque, and no one in the world would know what his mother had done for 22 years inside that shed. He had spent his entire life making people disappear. It was the only skill he had, and this time, for the first time, he didn't need anyone to disappear. He needed someone to stay and answer. He picked up the folder and closed it. "You're getting out of Harborline," Dylan said. "Today. Sell me your share for $1. Get out of Stone Court. Get out of Bayfront. Get out of all of it," Marco laughed, genuinely surprised. Or I do something I've never done before," Dylan said. He turned and walked toward the warehouse door. At the threshold, he stopped, but didn't look back. "I'll talk." He didn't go home. He drove to 325 Washington Street. Parked in the visitor section, walked through the front entrance, and told the person at the desk that he wanted to see Inspector Claire Doyle. The person looked at him and asked his name. He gave it. He was told to wait, and Dylan sat down in an orange plastic chair between a man waiting to retrieve his towed car and an elderly woman there to report a stolen wallet, and he remained there for 19 minutes. Doyle appeared at the end of the hallway and stopped when she saw him. She was 44 years old, her hair tied low at the nape of her neck, wearing an old cloth coat, and she had spent the final 6 years of her career trying to bring Dylan Vance into court without ever making it past the first stage. She looked at him for about 5 seconds, her hand instinctively drifting towards her service weapon as her officers fell deathly silent. The Mafia boss of Federal Hill just walked into her precinct without a single bodyguard. Then she said, "What is the Don of Providence doing in my lobby without his army of lawyers?" "I don't have one. Then I'm not speaking to you." "You will," Dylan said, rising to his feet. "Because I brought you something, and you'll want to see it before you throw me out." She took him into an interrogation room, not her office, and left the door open, and she didn't invite him to sit. She folded her arms. "You have 3 minutes." Dylan placed the folder on the table. He opened it and began arranging the documents in rows, slowly, as though dealing cards. His mother's black notebook opened to the final page. 7 annual transfer forms dated March of 2023. A chart showing the 3 corporate layers, 16 Mill, Bayfront, Stone Court, and at the end, Harborline Holdings. 3 years of Riverbend financial records. The supply spreadsheet with 6 clusters of dates circled in red ink. And finally, the last document, a copy of the complaint filed with the Rhode Island State Veterinary Board in December of 2024, 11 pages, with a real signature, a real address, and a real telephone number in the upper corner. Doyle didn't move for 20 seconds. Then she lowered her arms, stepped closer to the table, and began reading while standing. She didn't sit. She read the Harborline signature page twice. She studied the 3-layer ownership chart for a long time. "This is your company," she said. "I own 15%. My brother owns the rest. You signed these." She turned over one sheet, 9 times. "You're handing me documents bearing your own signature." Yes. She looked up. "You know this implicates you, don't you, Vance? Do you understand what I'm holding? This is the source of the money. This is the chain of ownership. If this is true, I can send it to the federal authorities before lunch, and within 6 months you'll be sitting in this room in a very different capacity." "I know. Then why?" He didn't answer immediately. He only pushed the final document, all 11 pages of it, toward her. "Because of this," he said. Doyle looked down. She read the name in the upper corner, and Dylan saw it happen, that very small moment when her expression changed. "Ward," she said. She read the next 2 lines. Then she stopped. "Naomi Ward, you know that name." Doyle didn't answer. She turned one page, then another. And Dylan knew exactly what she was remembering because he had spent 3 hours the previous night finding it. Shortly after she was set up, he said, "She called this station. She spoke to the officer on duty. It was reduced to a single line and transferred to the civil complaints file. That case was closed after 11 days. Doyle placed the pages on the table. "We dropped her case last year," she said. There was nothing in her voice. She was under investigation by the board for stealing medication. She had no permanent address. The telephone number she left stopped working after 3 weeks. A witness like that wouldn't survive in front of a jury, and you know that better than I do." "I know," Dylan said. She was right. Doyle looked at him. She had been right since December of 2024, he said. "Everything on this table only proves what was already written in those 11 pages. I didn't bring this evidence here to save myself. I brought it so that complaint would no longer be only the word of a homeless woman. Now it's the word of a homeless Met woman, backed by 3 years of my financial records." Doyle remained silent for a very long time. She wasn't moved. Dylan could see that clearly. She still hated him, still believed he was exactly what she had believed him to be for the past 6 years, and she was calculating what this would cost her. "I don't understand you," she said at last. "You don't need to." Dylan tapped 2 fingers against the 11 pages. "You put it down," he said. "Now pick it back up." Julian Reeves knew he had been exposed within 36 hours, and he didn't send anyone to the house, and he didn't call with threats. And that was what made Dylan understand he was dealing with something far more dangerous than he had imagined. On the morning of the 21st, a man in a cloth coat walked up the steps of 41 Vinton Street, asked for Naomi Ward, handed her a thick packet of envelopes, wished her a good day, and left. There were 3 things inside. The first was a civil complaint filed in Providence County Court, Riverbend Veterinary Group versus Naomi Ward, alleging unlawful possession of property. The second was a petition for an emergency animal seizure order, citing a health risk to an animal being held by someone without a professional certification. The third was a copy of the notice sent to the City Animal Control Department, with a hearing scheduled for 9 o'clock in the morning on February 23rd, 48 hours. Naomi read everything in 4 minutes, placed the papers on the kitchen table, and sat perfectly still. "Look at this," she said. "Read the property description." Dylan read it. Riverbend claimed that the animal, a female Neapolitan Mastiff, had been accepted by the facility as an abandoned dog of unknown ownership, carrying no identification device, and had been housed and cared for at the facility's expense ever since. On this paper, Naomi said, "Bruna is furniture. I'm a thief with a drug investigation in my history. And you're Dylan Vance. And they don't need to say anything more about you. They only need to write down your name." She pushed the papers away. "This is how men kill people. Not with their hands, with forms. He doesn't need to win. He only needs the seizure order. The dog goes back to Riverbend, and then she disappears from the paperwork, like those other 31 dogs, and there's no chip, no evidence, no case left at all. My complaint dies a second time." Sal arrived at 10 o'clock, read the papers, and said nothing for a long while before telling them he had seen this happen 3 times in 40 years, and all 3 times the dog had lost. Dylan sat at the head of the table and said nothing. He looked at the documents and counted. He knew the judge assigned to that hearing. He knew her husband had a loan that was going bad. He knew the exact 3 calls he needed to make, and he knew they would work because they always worked, and his entire life had been built on the certainty that they always worked. Then he thought of the 8 words in the notebook upstairs. Never Dylan. He stood, walked to the drawer, and took out the printed sheet Sal had clipped into the file on the 15th. The chip registry search result. He placed it on the table between the 3 of them. "Read their complaint again," he said. "Read exactly what they wrote." Naomi picked it up. "An abandoned dog, owner unknown, carrying no identification device." "Yes," Dylan said. "They signed that statement." Reeves signed it, filed it with the court. He tapped the printed sheet with 1 finger. The chip was registered on April 11th, 2022. Registered owner, Rosalind Vance, 41 Vinton Street. It was implanted 11 months before that dog ever entered Riverbend. Sal's head came up sharply. "It still scans," he said slowly. "I scanned it in front of 2 witnesses. I called the registry. There's a call log. There's a date and time. We don't need to prove the dog belonged to my mother," Dylan said. "We don't need to win the ownership question. The chip isn't the ownership card." He looked at Naomi. "It's the lie card." She understood before Sal did. He saw the realization pass across her face. "Oh God," she said. "Every veterinary clinic has a scanner," Dylan said. "State law requires them to scan every identified animal at intake. It's the most basic procedure in their profession." Reeves declared to the court that this dog carried no identification device. There are only 2 possibilities. 1, they scanned her, saw Rosalind Vance's name, and still declared the owner unknown, which means they knowingly made a false statement to the court. 2, they didn't scan her, which means they violated mandatory procedure, and every intake record they have created over the past 3 years becomes worthless. He sat down. Both doors lead to the same place. The record they're using to claim this dog as their property is fraudulent. A fraudulent record doesn't create ownership. It doesn't create anything. Sal removed his glasses and rubbed his face. 3 years, he said. She carried that inside her for 3 years. No one spoke. Dylan looked toward the fireplace, toward the creature breathing on the rug, and thought of the thin white scar hidden beneath her fur, invisible unless someone shaved it away. Someone had tried to remove the chip, failed, given up, and left the dog with a 15-digit piece of glass, displaced beneath her armpit, and for the next 3 years, no one remembered it was there, while she carried it through 6 litters, through the chain, through 4.5 miles of snow, all the way back to the very door where it had been implanted. The thing they had scarred her trying to remove was the very thing that would destroy them. "There's one more thing," Dylan said. Rosalind Vance died without a will. All of her property, including her animals, passed to her sole legal heir under Rhode Island inheritance law. He didn't say his own name. He didn't need to. On the night of the 22nd, Doyle called at 7 o'clock and told him she needed him at the station to sign a sworn statement before the hearing began, and she said plainly that she didn't trust him, which was exactly why she needed his signature on paper instead of his promise over the phone. He left at 7:30. Sal had gone home that afternoon, leaving behind a spare bag of fluids and a red medical alert button that he had taped to the cabinet beside the sink, the kind he usually gave to elderly women who lived alone. And he had made a joke about it, and no one had laughed. Naomi stayed behind. She cooked instant noodles. She checked the 2 puppies. She sat down on the floor beside the rug and read through the court papers for the 4th time, marking in pencil the lines she would have to answer. And she kept doing that until 9:30, when she heard it. Not a sound, the absence of one. The dog, asleep, had stopped breathing in its old rhythm. She didn't lift her head. She only opened her eyes and looked toward the back door. Naomi switched off the desk lamp. 14 months of sleeping in a car in a parking lot had taught her 3 things. And the first was that darkness belonged to whoever had lived inside it longer. She listened. Snow crunched beneath shoes. 3 people. No talking. No knock. People knocked when they wanted something from inside. They didn't knock when they intended to carry something out. She crawled to the kitchen cabinet beneath the sink, opened it, swept every bottle and container onto the floor with one motion of her arm, lined the inside with the wool blanket, and placed the 2 puppies inside. She closed the cabinet door, leaving a narrow crack. Then she reached up to the counter, pulled Sal's red button free from the tape, closed it tightly in her left hand, and didn't press it. She held the storm lantern in her right hand and didn't turn it on. She backed into the corner of the kitchen and sat down. The latch on the back door gave a dry click. Someone was testing the lock. Then came the sound of metal sliding into the gap around the door. Naomi sat still in the darkness, listening to her heart pounding, thinking of her phone lying on the table 6 feet away, directly in sight of anyone who opened the door, and she didn't go for it. Then she heard footsteps on the living room rug. They had entered through the front door. The front door wasn't locked because this was Federal Hill, and this was the Vance house. And for 20 years, no one in the world had needed to lock the front door of that house. 3 flashlight beams swept across the ceiling. A man's voice said very quietly, "Where's the dog?" And that was when the mastiff stood. Naomi heard her before she saw her. The scrape of claws across the wood, slow, heavy, uneven, because of the damaged front leg, the sound of the intravenous needle pulling free from the tape, and the low growl a body made when it rose using strength it no longer possessed. 130 pounds. Sick. 4 days earlier, she hadn't been able to drink water by herself. She took 3 steps into the center of the kitchen doorway and stood there, filling its entire width, and she didn't bark. She growled, not loudly. That was the worst part. A loud growl was a warning, but the sound coming from the center of that doorway was low and steady, with no room left for negotiation. It was the sound of something that had finished calculating and had already made its decision, and it filled the house from floor to ceiling. All 3 flashlight beams froze. In the light behind her, Naomi saw the dog's shadow stretching across the living room wall, and she understood in that moment that those 3 men didn't see the sick animal she had been feeding with a syringe for 8 days. They saw 130 pounds standing between them and what they had come to take. One voice, quieter now, said stop. Footsteps moved back 1 pace. Then Naomi pressed the button. Sal's medical alarm was the kind given to 80-year-old women, and it was designed so a deaf person on the 2nd floor could hear it. And inside a 2-story wooden house at 10 o'clock at night, it erupted like a sawmill. At the same moment, Naomi smashed the storm lantern against the edge of the cabinet. Glass exploded across the floor. She screamed, not from fear. She screamed one word as loudly as she could. The 1 hour and 14 months in a parking lot, yet her was the only one that worked. Fire. Then 3 things happened in 4 seconds. The neighbor's porch light came on. A sweep of helicopters through the kitchen window. Dillon's car turned up the slope of Vinton Street. And the 3 men ran, not in any organized way, but like people caught in the act, crashing into one another at the front doorway. And one of them dropped his flashlight and didn't return for it. The dog didn't chase them. She remained in the kitchen doorway until the last footsteps had left the porch. Then she sat. Then she lay down. Dillon kicked the door open while the alarm was still screaming. And what he saw was Naomi sitting on the kitchen floor amid broken glass, holding that enormous head in her lap, the 2 puppies crying inside the cabinet beneath the sink, and not a single chair overturned. No one had touched her. He dropped to his knees. He placed one hand against the dog's ribs. She was breathing. But she was breathing differently. Saul arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he didn't curse the snow. And that was the first sign. He knelt beside the rug and did everything he always did, listened to her heart, counted the rhythm, ran his hands along each leg, and he did all of it longer than necessary. And Dillon understood that he was no longer searching for anything. He was only stretching out the time before he had to turn around. Then he sat down on the floor, with his back against the leg of a chair, and removed glasses. He didn't wipe them. He only held them in his hand. He sat that way for a very long time. "No one touched her last night," he said at last. "I know, not last night, Dillon." He looked into the fire. 3 years. 6 litters in 34 months. The chain. The infection she was carrying before she ever reached this house. The storm. 4.5 miles through the snow, with 2 puppies beneath her chest and not a single calorie saved herself. He put his glasses back on, then removed them again. The body has an account. It can borrow. It can borrow for a very long time, but no one forgives the debt. Naomi sat on the floor and said nothing. "She has used it all," Sal said. "She spent everything she had to reach that door, and she reached it. For the past 9 days, she hasn't been recovering. She has been waiting." Dillon didn't ask what she had been waiting for. "She was waiting to be certain," Sal said. Then he stood, gathered his bag, and didn't ask Dillon what he wanted him to do, because they both knew the answer, and he went out onto the porch and stood there alone for a very long time. They spread the wool blanket in front of the fireplace. Not somewhere else. Right there, in the exact place where she had collapsed on the night of February 14th after Dillon carried her across the threshold. On the braided rug his mother had bought at a flea market in a year no one could remember anymore. Naomi lifted the 2 puppies out of the cabinet and placed them against their mother's chest. The dark brown one crawled forward first, foolish and warm, pressing its nose into the place where it always pressed its nose. The smaller blue-gray one moved more slowly, and Naomi had to nudge it a little. The dog lowered her head. She smelled the first puppy, then she smelled the second. She did it slowly and carefully, just as she had on the doorstep that night, counting them, and Dillon realized she had counted them that way every day for 9 days, and this was the final time. Then she laid her head down on the blanket. Dillon knelt beside her. He placed his hand on her head between her ears, in the place where another hand had rested during the spring of 2022 in this very room. He wasn't accustomed to doing this. He had never spoken the words he was about to say to anyone, and he said them in a very quiet voice, the voice he used when no one else was in the room, even though there were 3 people there. "I heard you," he said. "You knocked on the door, and this time I heard you." The fire gave a soft crack. "You can go." The dog opened her eyes. She looked at Naomi first. She looked at her for a very long time, at the woman who had cut the chain, who had crawled 4.5 miles through the snow behind her and fallen face down 100 feet from the door, who had fed her with a needleless syringe inside the last kennel of Row B when she had still believed the world operated decently. Naomi began to cry. She couldn't stop it, and she didn't try, and she pressed her face into the blanket beside the dog's shoulder and wept aloud, and no one told her to be quiet. Then the dog turned her eyes toward Dillon, the son of the only woman in her life who had ever spoken her name with kindness. She looked at him, and there was nothing in that gaze except peace, the peace of a creature that had finally handed over what she had carried for 4.5 miles in 3 years. She lifted her head about 4 inches. She licked his hand, once, only once, then she stopped. 9:06 in the morning. The apple-shaped clock on the wall still wasn't running. Dylan knew the time because he looked at his wrist, at his father's cracked Patek, the watch that still kept perfect time as though the years had never tried to take it away. And he looked at the two hands and didn't need anyone to explain the coincidence to him, and he didn't speak it aloud. Sal came in from the porch, stood in the doorway, and went no farther. Naomi was still crying. Dylan didn't cry. He sat down on the floor with his legs folded and left his hand where it was, between her ears, resting on the black fur. The fire burned. Then the fire grew smaller. Then someone added more wood, and he didn't know who. At some point, Naomi carried the two puppies away, and he didn't hear her. At some point, Sal left, and he didn't hear him. The sunlight moved from the leg of the table to the leg of the chair, and then to the foot of the fireplace. He sat there for 4 hours without lifting his hand, until the fur beneath his palm had gone completely cold. 3 years earlier, his mother had died alone in a room 11 minutes from where he stood, while his phone vibrated 6 times inside his coat pocket. This time he had been there. He had been there through all of it. The hearing on the morning of February 23rd lasted 14 minutes. Riverbend's attorney stood and withdrew the petition before the judge could even call the case, because the night before, they had received a copy of the microchip register results along with the call log from the registration service, and no lawyer in the world was willing to stand before a court and defend a sworn statement they had just learned was false. But withdrawing the petition saved no one. It had already been filed, and a false declaration submitted to a court didn't simply disappear. Doyle transferred the entire file to the prosecutor's office that same afternoon. 3 weeks later, Riverbend Veterinary closed its doors. 7 months later, Julian Reeves was indicted by a federal grand jury on 11 counts under the Animal Welfare Act and 9 counts of wire fraud, and the brass plaque in the lobby of the University Veterinary Hospital was removed on a Tuesday morning without anyone notifying the press. Marco sold his share of Harborline for $1. He cooperated as far as his attorneys permitted, testified enough to avoid prosecution, and lost everything he had within the organization in 4 months, because in that world, people could forgive many things, but they couldn't forgive someone who sat down at a table with prosecutors. The last time the brothers spoke was in the parking lot behind the federal courthouse. Marco was still smiling. "You traded an empire for a dead dog," he said. "No," Dylan answered. "I traded it for the chance to be my mother's son." As for Dylan, there was no miracle waiting for him. The 9 times he had signed Harborline documents were 9 real signatures, and signatures didn't care about motives. He pleaded guilty to 2 financial charges and received 18 months at a low-security federal facility in Devens, and he didn't appeal. And when his attorney asked whether he wanted to try another strategy, he said no. The state veterinary board restored Naomi Ward's professional certification the following summer, accompanied by a 3-letter containing 1 sentence that said the board acknowledged the matter, and not a single sentence that said they were sorry. Doyle was more direct. She found Naomi in the courthouse hallway and stood there for a moment before speaking. "You were right from the beginning," Doyle said. "No one listened because you didn't have an address. That was our failure, not yours." During those 18 months, Naomi wrote every week. She didn't write about feelings, she wrote about dogs. The dark brown puppy was named Pepper. She learned to sit in 3 days, then forgot how for 4. The blue-gray puppy was named Otto. He ate 1 shoe in August and ate the other in September to keep things balanced. Sal had returned to work part-time and cursed more than before. The shed behind the garden had a new roof. In her 40th letter, she wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. "I'm not waiting for you. I want you to understand that clearly. I'm only still here." "There's a difference," he answered with 1 line. "I know. Stay there." On the warm morning his release date finally arrived. Dylan Vance walked out through the gates at Devens, with no black car waiting, no line of people standing to greet him. There was only a 2004 Corolla parked in the visitor lot, and a woman leaning against its door, and when he climbed inside, warm air poured from the vents. She had repaired the heater. They drove home to Vinton Street. In the front yard, mounted between 2 wooden posts, stood a sign carved by a retired boat builder who had refused payment but accepted cake. Vinton Street Rescue. Established in 2000 by Rosalind Vance. Beneath it, in smaller letters, were the words, "Leave the light on." In the yard were 2 black mastiffs, 18 months old and already nearly the size of calves. They came charging out, Pepper tripping over her own feet, while Otto dropped heavily onto Dylan's foot and remained sitting there, proud of the mountain he had just conquered. Beside the back door, hanging from a brass hook, was the tag bearing 3 hand-carved letters, with the final stroke of the V driven too deep. It wasn't hidden in a drawer. It hadn't been buried with anyone. Beneath it hung a new tag, engraved with the same punch Naomi had found inside a toolbox in the attic, and it carried one name, Bruna. Dylan touched them both. She was right, he said quietly. About everything. Naomi stood in the kitchen doorway holding a cup of coffee. She didn't ask whether he was all right. The coffee's cold, she said. I'll make another, he said, her name. Naomi. Only that, nothing more. There had been a winter when he had needed to ask 3 times before he could remember that name, and now it was the easiest word he had ever spoken. Then he kissed her, there on the back threshold of 41 Vinton Street, in the exact place where a dog had scratched 3 times on a February morning and changed everything. Some miracles don't arrive cleanly, and they don't arrive loudly. Some miracles come through the snow, exhausted, carrying evidence inside their own bodies, and knock 3 times, very softly, on a door that has been closed for 20 years. Dylan Vance didn't change because he suddenly became a good man. He changed because a creature that couldn't speak a human language stood at his door and refused to leave. And Naomi Ward had been telling the truth for 14 months, and no one listened, not because she was wrong, but because she was poor, because she had no address where anyone could send a reply. That is how this world so often decides who deserves to be believed. The lesson is simple and very difficult to follow. Listen to the person speaking before you look at where they sleep. A human being doesn't lose their worth because they lose their home. An accusation doesn't become false because the person making it has nothing. And kindness rarely arrives at a convenient moment. It usually comes when the world is coldest, asks the most from us, and gives us only one chance to open the door. If this story touched you, please press the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they still deserve to be heard, and subscribe to our channel for compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And in your own life, has anyone ever been ignored simply because they had nothing in their hands? Or has there ever been a time when you were the one who failed to listen? Please leave a comment. We truly want to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day to come. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.